Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I want to talk about one of the most ironic developments we've seen in Russia's economy since the war in Ukraine began. Russia is one of the world's biggest oil and gas economies, and its entire model is built around extracting energy from the ground, selling that energy to the rest of the world, and using those revenues to fund the state. Oil and gas are not just another industry in Russia, they are the foundation of the Russian economy. They fund the government, the currency, they provide export earnings, they generate tax revenue, they support huge numbers of jobs. And they are absolutely central to Russia's position in the world. But now, because of the fuel shortages spreading across Russia, something very unusual is happening. Russian motorists are being pushed towards electric vehicles. And that is potentially very bad news for Russia over the long term, because every Russian driver who switches from petrol or diesel to an electric vehicle becomes a little bit less dependent on gasoline, diesel and refined oil products. And that means Russia is, in effect, forcing its own people to reduce demand for the very products its economy depends upon. Even more remarkably, many of the electric vehicles benefiting from this shift are Chinese. So Russia's fuel crisis is not only damaging Russia's domestic oil industry, it's also helping China sell more cars, build more influence, and capture more long-term value from Russian consumers. And that's a very interesting reversal. Now, before we get into the details on all of this, could I ask anybody watching this video to give me a thumbs up and maybe hit that hype button, which is just alongside the thumbs up button. It helps to promote this video with the YouTube algorithm, so it'll do me a favor, so that would be fantastic. And also, if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button. That also helps me with the algorithm and puts a smile on my face. Okay, over the last few weeks, we have seen fuel shortages spreading across more and more parts of Russia. This has not just been a small local disruption, this is now a nationwide issue. There are queues at gasoline stations, there are restrictions on how much fuel drivers are allowed to buy, there have been regions prioritising emergency services and essential users, and reports of fuel stations running completely dry. And in some areas, motorists have been forced to drive around searching for stations that still have anything. This is a huge problem in a country the size of Russia. Just to put it into perspective, Russia stretches across 11 time zones. 11 time zones. If you go from one end of Russia to the other, you'd have to change your watch 11 times. It has enormous distances between its big cities. Many communities are remote and supply chains depend on road transport. And agriculture, which is a huge part of the Russian economy, depends heavily on diesel. Food distribution depends on fuel. Public services are also entirely dependent upon it. So when gasoline and diesel become scarce, the problem doesn't just affect people going on holiday or driving to the shops. It affects the whole economy. Farmers, delivery companies, bus services, local businesses, which then feeds into prices and affects the daily lives of ordinary people. That is why this crisis is such a sensitive issue for the Kremlin. For years, Russians have been told that their country is an energy superpower. Russia has oil, Russia has gas, Russia has pipelines, Russia has refineries and tankers and energy relationships with all countries around the world. And yet Russian motorists are now queuing for fuel inside one of the largest energy producing countries. That is embarrassing. But the next stage of the story is even more interesting, because when motorists can't reliably buy gasoline or diesel, they start thinking about alternative options. And one of those alternatives is electricity. In a recent announcement, Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear corporation, has reported a sharp increase in demand at its electric vehicle charging stations. Rosatom operates more than 290 charging stations and said usage has increased by over 40% over the past 7 days. Now, we need to keep this into perspective. Russia isn't suddenly becoming Norway. Electric vehicles still represent a relatively small part of the total Russian car market. Russia has a difficult climate and it operates over huge distances. And charging infrastructure is still relatively limited. That's why 290 stations is seen as being a big network. For many people, electric vehicles are still too expensive, but the direction of travel, when you look at what's happening, that is absolutely key, because once people start thinking seriously about electric vehicles, the psychology changes. A fuel shortage is not just an inconvenience, it's a trigger. It makes people ask different questions. Can I rely on gasoline? Will diesel be available next week? Will prices keep rising? Will I be stuck in a queue for hours again? Would it be easier if I could charge my car at home? Would it be cheaper if I can use electricity instead? That's how consumer behaviour starts to shift. And Rosatom's own comments are really interesting here. The company is suggesting that these shortages will influence future purchasing decisions. And I think that's the key point. Car markets don't change overnight, they change gradually, one purchase decision at a time. A driver who's previously planning to buy another gas car may now consider buying a plug-in hybrid or a fully electric vehicle. A family that has access to a home charging point may start thinking about electricity as their main form of travel. A taxi operator may start calculating whether electricity is more reliable than petrol and may be cheaper too. And businesses will start looking at electric vans in the same way as Amazon has. And once that process begins, it's very difficult to reverse, because once a driver has switched to electricity, they no longer need to buy gasoline every week. That demand disappears immediately. And if enough people make that decision over time, it starts to affect the market. That's why the long-term strategy is a problem for Russia. Russia's economy depends on selling oil and gas. But electric vehicles reduce demand for oil products. A gasoline car creates constant demand for gasoline. A diesel van creates constant demand for diesel. A petrol taxi is buying fuel every day, as is a diesel truck. But an electric vehicle doesn't consume any gasoline. It only uses electricity. That electricity might still be generated using gas, coal, nuclear, or hydro, depending on your energy system. But it's not petrol, it's not the refined product, it's not diesel, which comes out of a refinery, it's not refined oil products, which are in demand at the petrol stations. So if Russia's own fuel crisis pushes more people towards electric vehicles, Russia is effectively accelerating a trend that weakens part of its long-term economic base. And I think that's quite ironic. Russia has spent decades depending on oil demand. Now its own domestic users are encouraging motorists to reduce their dependence on oil. The numbers are relatively small at the moment, but they are growing rapidly. As at the end of April, there were around 210,000 electric vehicles in total in Russia. However, in the period between January and May, there have been 24,600 unit sales, which is an increase of 125% year on year. That is a really big turnaround. Now, this doesn't mean that petrol and diesel are going to disappear overnight, but what it does show is that the market is shifting. And in a crisis, small changes can become important because they show where consumer behaviour is heading. We're only at the start of this fuel shortage in Russia. As it carries on, it's likely there's going to be increasing demand for electric vehicles. Now, if we now move on to the second major part of this story, China. Because if Russia is pushed towards electric vehicles, who is going to benefit from that? Well, it certainly won't be Russia, because they're not producing a huge amount of electric vehicles. The main winner is going to be China. Chinese car makers have become dominant with electric vehicles globally. The International Energy Agency estimates that around 60% of all electric vehicles in 2025 came from China. China has spent years building the world's most powerful electric vehicle industry. It dominates battery production, supply chains, and has huge manufacturing scale. And it also operates a very aggressive pricing strategy. And its car makers are now expanding all over the world. Russia is a particularly important opportunity because Western car makers have pulled back after the invasion of Ukraine. That created a huge gap in the Russian car market, and Chinese brands moved in. Chinese cars are now a major presence in Russia. And when it comes to electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids, that influence is even more significant. It was recently reported that Chinese brands are now totally dominant in Russia's growing EV market, with Zeekr becoming one of the standout names. Autostat data shows Chinese-linked brands such as Zeekr, Avatar, Geely and BYD are appearing amongst Russia's biggest electric vehicle sales. In the plug-in hybrid market, Chinese models are also important, with brands such as Li Auto and Voya playing a major role. So this isn't just a story about Russian motorists changing their technology. It's a story about Russia handing long-term consumer value to China. Every time a Russian buyer chooses a Chinese electric vehicle, money flows out of Russia into a Chinese company. Every time a Russian buyer chooses a Chinese plug-in hybrid, China gains market share. Every time Chinese brands become more normal on Russian roads, China strengthens its position. If you see a lot of those cars, you think, oh, I've seen a lot of those, I might buy one. And this matters because car purchases are long-term decisions. A car's not like a cup of coffee. People keep cars for years. And once a brand gets into a market, it builds trust, establishes a servicing network, and becomes familiar to consumers, and then becomes very hard to dislodge. So Russia's fuel crisis is doing something much bigger than creating short-term inconvenience for drivers. It's helping China lock in a deeper position inside the Russian economy. That is a huge strategic shift. Before the war, Russia had access to European, Japanese, Korean, and American cars. Since the war, much of that has changed. China has filled the gap, and if the future of the car industry is electric in Russia, then Russia is now becoming increasingly dependent on China for that future. That isn't a strength of its own economy. That is becoming a dependence. And it's especially uncomfortable because Russia likes to present itself as a superpower. But in this market, Russia is increasingly looking like a customer, not a market leader. China makes the cars, China makes the batteries, it controls much of the supply chain, and Russia is providing the buyers for all of those vehicles. That is not the position an energy superpower wants to find itself in. The other important point is that electric vehicles do not only reduce demand for fuel, they also change the infrastructure around transport. Instead of building more gasoline stations, countries build charging networks. Instead of fuel logistics, they build grid capacity. Instead of tanker trucks delivering gasoline, they need electricity distribution. Instead of refinery margins, the value moves into batteries, software, charging equipment, and electricity networks. And again, that's moving the value away from traditional oil and gas. For Russia, this is a problem on two levels. At the domestic level, more electric vehicles means less demand for refined fuel. At the international level, if the world keeps moving towards electric vehicles, then global demand for gasoline and diesel comes under pressure as well, and Russia can't afford for that to happen. Its budget depends heavily on energy revenues. Its trade position depends heavily on oil and gas. Its geopolitical leverage has historically depended on being a major player in the oil and gas export market. So anything that reduces oil demand is a long-term threat to Russia's economic model. And now, remarkably, Russia's own fuel shortages are helping demonstrate why motorists might want to escape oil dependency altogether. This is the part that I find so fascinating. The Kremlin doesn't want Russians to abandon gasoline because of climate policy. It doesn't want motorists switching to electric cars because they've lost confidence in fuel supplies. And it doesn't want Chinese companies to be the big winners from a crisis that Russia created itself. But unfortunately, that dynamic is now emerging. Fuel shortages create frustration. Frustration changes behaviour. Behaviour changes purchasing decisions. Purchasing decisions change the structure of demand. And once demand starts shifting, it doesn't usually go back. So while the immediate story is about queues at gas stations, rationing, shortages, and angry motorists, the deeper story is about Russia's future, because Russia is not just struggling to supply fuel today, it may also be encouraging people to think about a future where they don't need that fuel at all. And for a country whose economy is built on oil and gas, that is a very dangerous development. The Russian economy has always benefited from dependence. Countries needed Russian oil and gas and diesel and other refined products, and that dependence created power for Russia. But electric vehicles reduced that dependence. And if this Russian crisis is forcing more people to electric vehicles, then the Kremlin has created a problem that goes far beyond this summer's shortages. It's created a reason for its own citizens to move away from the products that fuel Russia's economy. And it's created an opening for China to capture even bigger part of Russia's consumer market. And that's why this story matters. It's not just about cars or charging stations or queues at gasoline stations. It's about a country built on oil being forced to confront a transport system that may slowly need less oil. And that's a very uncomfortable position for Russia to be in. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, most importantly thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and maybe hit that hype button if you can see it. I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone that supported me. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or member, thank you for that support. It really does help to keep me going. In fact, on many occasions when I've thought about just stopping doing this altogether, it's been you guys that really have stopped me from doing that, because I thought I can't let people down, and there are people who are supporting me, so I need to carry on. So thank you, it's important to me, it does keep me motivated. Also wanted to mention that my new channel, Build and Design, is now live. You can check out loads of really interesting videos there. Please help us out, we need to build our subscribers and watch time.